Friends, have you ever had a hard time keeping a secret? I remember one time when my family and I threw a huge surprise birthday party for my mom, and it was super hard to not give it away. So here's what happened. My dad took my mom out to dinner, while my brother and I entertained a house full of guests. Once everyone was ready, I picked up the phone and called my mom. Here's what I said. The microwave exploded. There are sparks. There's clouds of smoke filling the room. This is an emergency. You need to come home and save us. How do you think she reacted? She reacted frantically on the phone, and she is super gullible. So she was like, you need to call the fire truck, get all the neighbors involved. You need to get out of the house right now. And that made it even harder to keep a secret because I felt so bad for putting her through that worry and anxiety. Long story short, she made it home and we celebrated her. It was definitely one of the most memorable birthday experiences for her. Now let me explain how this connects to our Bible story. There was a group of people called the Arameans, and the Arameans were enemies of the Israelites. They were fighting each other constantly. The king of the Arameans noticed that they kept losing. He said, the Israelites seem to always know where we are going to be, and they beat us to that spot. They know our secret plans and are winning all the time. Why is that? Well, what was happening was God was showing the Arameans' battle plans to Elisha. And Elisha was telling the Israelites so that they were winning. They had an advantage. They had the upper hand. Remember, who is Elisha? Elisha is the man that took over for the prophet Elijah and experienced twice as much of God's power. Elisha was a big deal to the Israelites and even a bigger threat to the Arameans. The king of Aram found out that God was speaking to Elisha and showing him his battle plan. So he was super angry and he wanted to capture him. Have you ever been playing a game of cards or maybe a board game like Battleship, and somebody was secretly peeking over your shoulder and seeing your cards? And then they were playing really well because they knew what you had in your hand. How did that make you feel? Maybe pretty angry, right? You're like, why? You're cheating. You're seeing my hand. Well, God was seeing the battle plan cards of the enemy, and he was telling them to Elisha. So we see the situation we're in, right? The king of the Arameans was super angry. He was infuriated. And now let's pick up our story. In 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 13, it says this. Go find out where he is, the king ordered, so I can send men and capture him. The report came back. Elisha is in Dothan. Then he sent horses and chariots and a strong force there. They went by night and surrounded the city. When Elisha's servant got up and went out early the next morning, an army with horses and chariots surrounded the city. Oh no, what shall we do? The servant asked. Don't be afraid, Elisha answered. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And Elisha prayed, open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see. Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and saw hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. What a powerful story here, and it's not quite over yet. But we see that Elisha is faced with a very real problem, right? Would you agree with me that if you were surrounded by chariots, horses, and countless soldiers, would that be a big problem? Yeah, that would be a pretty big deal, and that would be terrifying. Elisha's servant was absolutely terrified. He saw this army. He's like, what are we going to do? But did Elisha freak out? No. Elisha said, don't be afraid, for there are more with us than with them. Elisha was able to see something that his servant could not see. Elisha saw that God was with him and that the army of God, the army of heaven, was right there in the hills with chariots, horses, and fire ready to fight on Elisha's behalf. Then he prayed that God would open up his servant's eyes so that he could see God's army there, ready to fight. And once his servant saw that, he was like, "Oh yeah, I see why you say we don't need to be afraid." Because they had a clear advantage. God's army was so much bigger, so much more powerful, that they were going to be able to defeat the Arameans. No big deal at all. This was awesome, right? And would you ever say that you would be surrounded by an army? Is that possible? Is that something that we regularly experience? Like, oh, we've got a ton of enemies ready to capture us, kill us. No, that's not very common. So now let's try to think of how this story relates to our lives, right? We may not be surrounded by a huge army, but we could be surrounded, and often are, by problems, worries, fears, things that are challenging, and they can be overwhelming, right? And in your life, you will have trouble. There are going to be hard things that you face. And those circumstances, those situations can feel overwhelming. Just like how Elisha's servant felt very overwhelmed by the massive army ready to capture them. And then Elisha asked that God would open his eyes. Did you know that God is with us? God and his army of angels is with us, even though we can't see him. Could Elisha's servant see the army of heaven originally? No, he couldn't. It was invisible. It was in a realm that he could not see. So just because Elisha's servant couldn't see God's army, does it mean that he was not there? No, absolutely not. In the same way, just because we can't physically see God and his army of angels ready to support us, strengthen us, and fight on our behalf, it doesn't mean that God isn't there. Let's think of glow-in-the-dark sticks for a moment, right? I brought in some glow-in-the-dark sticks. Have you guys ever played with these? They're super fun. I love glow-in-the-dark parties. But when the lights are on and when I haven't activated my sticks, they kind of look like regular sticks, right? There's nothing special about them. If they were scattered throughout the room, I may not notice them. They might be invisible to me. But if I turn the lights off and activate them, then I would notice, wow, this is so cool. There's glow-in-the-dark things everywhere. And you may have had experience with that, right? You need to be in the dark to see the glow sticks. Similarly, God and his angels, they are all around us, even though we can't see them with our physical eyes, or most of the time we don't see them, but it doesn't mean that they are not there. God is with us, and he is there to help us, to give us strength and courage, to comfort us. And so I really want you guys to remember that God is with us, just like how he was with Elisha. Let's keep reading to find out what happens next. In verse 18, it says this: As the enemy came down toward him, Elisha prayed to the Lord, "Strike this army with blindness." So God made the army blind, as Elisha had asked. Elisha told them, "This is not the road, and this is not the city. Follow me, and I will lead you to the man you are looking for." And he led them to Samaria. As they entered the city, Elisha said, "Lord, open the eyes of these men so they can see." Then the Lord opened their eyes, and they looked, and there they were inside Samaria. You can imagine how shocked this army was, because here, the very man that they were trying to capture was right in front of them, and he had led them into a completely different city. How funny, right? It's a funny story, because Elisha was completely disguised or completely invisible to the entire army, and he led them to a different place than they had intended. God provided a solution here, right? God answered Elisha's prayer and made the army blind. Do you want to know what else really interesting happened? Once the army was able to see again, Elisha fed them. Elisha and the king of Israel provided them with a free meal, and then they sent them home. Does anybody else like a free meal? Oh yeah, free food? Sign me up. Elisha gave them a free meal. There was no battle. Nobody got killed, but the Arameans actually left Israel alone after that. After that whole experience. We saw that God provided a heavenly solution to this very real problem. God's solution was so much better than anything that Elisha could have done. You think if Elisha took this matter into his own hands, would it have been more messy? Absolutely. It would have been messy. Maybe the people would have died. But God got involved, and that's because Elisha invited him into the situation. Elisha trusted him, and God provided a heavenly solution. And this solution was very amazing because Elisha was able to show kindness and mercy, forgiveness and love to his enemies. God works in ways that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense for us to love our enemies, for us to forgive people. But that's what God desires. That is his heart. And we see that in this story. So ultimately, I want you guys to remember that God is with us. And that's actually our main point. So let's say that together. God is with us. Can we say that one more time? God is with us.